The Ksar'tal Hegemony did not believe in myths. Warlord Kael'rath stood on the bridge of the extinction's edge, a vessel bristling with enough firepower to glass a continent, watching the holographic feed of Outpost 99. It was a tiny spinning needle of metal on the edge of the Sol system, a data reclamation center, which Kael'rath's intelligence officers had dismissed as a primitive library for a species too soft to defend its own borders. "No defensive shields, Warlord," the tactical officer reported, his mandibles clicking with predatory satisfaction. "Energy signatures are minimal, mostly life support and an oversized server bank. We could vaporize it with a single secondary battery." "No," Kael'rath gurgled, settling into his command throne like a satisfied predator. "The hegemony requires their archives. We take it intact. If these humans are as pathetic as the stories say, they will surrender the moment our boots hit the deck." The Ksar'tal boarding party was not a diplomatic team. They were six-legged shock troops encased in power armor, designed to withstand volcanic eruptions. When they breached the airlock, they expected plasma fire or desperate barricades. Instead, they found a chilling, scholarly silence. The station's interior was filled with rows of physical books and humming crystal data stacks. In the center of the main atrium sat a single human male named Gideon Vales. He looked ancient, his skin wrinkled like a dried fruit, wearing a faded blue sweater. He was carefully repairing an old mechanical clock with a tiny screwdriver, seemingly oblivious to the armored monsters surrounding him. "Human!" Kael'rath roared, his voice amplified to a deafening volume. "I am Warlord Kael'rath. This station and its secrets are now property of the hegemony. Stand and be shackled, or die in your seat." Gideon Vales didn't flinch. He adjusted a tiny gear, his fingers steady. Terrifyingly steady for a creature facing an invasion force. "You're early," Gideon said softly, his voice lacking any tremor of fear. "The coffee isn't even finished brewing yet. We do not care for your primitive beverages." Kael'rath stepped forward, his armored foot cracking the floor plating. He snatched the clock from Gideon's hand and crushed it into a twisted pile of scrap metal. "You are conquered. Your Annoyance Protocol is a bedtime story told by cowards. We see no warships. We see no monsters. We see only a frail animal." Gideon finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with terror. They were filled with a profound, exhausted sort of pity. "That clock was an heirloom," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "That was stage one. You should have stopped there." "My name is Gideon, and you've just interrupted a very important archive lock sequence?" Kael'rath mocked. "We will peel the data from your systems like skin from a fruit." "Warlord!" A frantic voice screamed over the Ksar'tal comms. It was the lead cryptographer back on the ship. "We've breached the first layer of the station's archives. It's not trade data. It's a biological containment log. We've triggered a universal alert originating from Earth's deepest continental fault zones." Kael'rath froze. On his wrist-mounted display, a new icon appeared. A simple human symbol. A yellow triangle with a black exclamation point. Below it, a single line of text in Galactic Standard, Annunciation Protocol activated. "The guards are waking up." "Warlord," Gideon said, his expression hardening into something ancient and predatory. "You didn't just invade a library, you invaded a cage. And you've just made me stage 2, concerned." Suddenly the station groaned. It wasn't the sound of metal stressing, it was the sound of a massive, gargantuan lung, taking its first breath in 10,000 years. Warlord Kael'rath's multiple eyes twitched as the station's breath rattled the very bulkheads of the extinction's edge. He stared at the small human, Gideon, who was now calmly sweeping the shards of his broken clock into a neat pile. The old man's indifference was no longer irritating. It was becoming a localized gravity well of dread. "Explain that sound!" Kael'rath barked, though his voice lacked its previous thunder. "That?" Gideon asked, not looking up. "That's the circulation system for the deeper vaults. It hasn't been active since the Three Worlds Crisis. You see, Warlord, humans don't actually like keeping records of what we used to be. It's bad for the brand. We'd much rather you think of us as the guys who provide excellent agricultural spreadsheets and agricultural consultants." Back on the flagship, the lead cryptographer, Xerath, was no longer screaming. He was whispering. His screens were flooded with data that bypassed every Ksar'tal firewall, pouring into their ship like an unstopped hemorrhage. It wasn't encrypted code. It was high-definition sensory playback. "Warlord," Xerath's voice came over the bridge speakers, trembling. "We aren't downloading trade secrets. We've unlocked a restricted archive titled The Sol Remittance, a history of Terran conflict. It's millions of hours of combat footage." Kael'rath watched as his own view screen was hijacked by the data stream. He didn't see the polite, smiling diplomats of the Galactic Council. He saw a planet in flames. He saw bipedal creatures, humans, tearing through each other with primitive fire and nuclear fission before they even understood the laws of gravity. He saw they didn't have exoskeletons or natural armor. They just had a terrifying, stubborn refusal to stay dead. They fought themselves for thousands of cycles. Xerath whimpered. They didn't unify because they found peace. They unified because they were so good at murder that they almost erased their own species. They chose diplomacy as a survival mechanism, not a philosophy. Gideon finally stood up. He was short, but he seemed to occupy the entire atrium now. "You see, Kael'rath, we're not peaceful," Gideon said, his voice as cold as the void outside. "We're just tired. We spent 5,000 years perfecting the art of the final solution. When we finally made it to the stars, we decided to be the accountants and the diplomats, because the alternative is, well, it's what's currently downloading into your bridge computers." The holographic map of the station shifted. Below the library layers, deep in the cage Elias had mentioned, 3 massive heat-generating signatures flared to life. They weren't ships. They were biological. "Warlord!" Xerath's voice was now a full-blown panic. "The data. It has a secondary header. It's titled The Custodians of the Deep Places. It's not just history. It's a list of creatures Earth found in its own crust. Things they couldn't kill, so they recruited them." Kael'rath looked at Gideon. "You are a library. You are supposed to be soft." "I am a librarian," Gideon corrected. "And a librarian's first job isn't to lend books. It's to make sure the things we don't want people to see stay in the dark." "But you broke the lock, Warlord. You broke my clock." A klaxon began to scream, not from the Ksar'tal ship, but from the station itself. It was a pitch reserved for catastrophic security breaches. Gideon checked a small, glowing tablet. Stage 3. The tight smile. "We have an incoming transmission from a human ship, Kael'rath. It's not a battlecruiser, it's a transport." "A transport?" Kael'rath hissed, trying to reclaim his fading authority. "We have 3,000 warships. What can a single transport do?" "It's carrying a very specific passenger," Gideon said. "A junior accountant named Vera from the Terran Damages and Reparations Office. She's here to discuss the bill for my grandfather's clock. And Kael'rath, she's significantly more annoyed than I am." As he spoke, a massive human vessel, white and orange marked with the symbols of the Student Flight Academy, dropped out of hyperspace. It didn't aim its guns at the Ksar'tal fleet. It didn't need to. Instead, 3,000 Ksar'tal weapon systems simultaneously reported a critical system failure. "Who is this Vera?" Kael'rath demanded, his mandibles quivering. "The woman who's about to tell you exactly how much your empire is worth in scrap metal," Gideon replied. The docking bay of Outpost 99 hissed as a small, unassuming human shuttle, the Ledger's Edge, settled into the berth with a precision that made the Ksar'tal pilots look like amateurs. The airlock cycled and a woman stepped out. She wasn't wearing powered armor or carrying a plasma rifle. She wore a sharp, charcoal-gray business suit, spectacles perched on her nose, and carried a data tablet like a holy relic. "Warlord Kael'rath, I presume?" the woman asked, her voice crisp and entirely too professional for a woman standing in a room full of 6-legged monsters. "I am Vera Thorne, junior accountant for the Terran Damages and Reparations Office. I'm here to process the invoice for the unauthorized entry and the destruction of a Class A family heirloom." Kael'rath's mandibles clicked in a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You send an accountant? My fleet has your station surrounded. My warriors are the finest in the hegemony." "Actually," Vera said, not looking up from her tablet, "your fleet is currently being used as a live-fire homework assignment for the Sol Academy's sophomore class." Kael'rath turned to his tactical screen. The holographic display showed his 3,000 warships, the pride of the Ksar'tal, drifting in disorganized clusters. They weren't being fired upon. Instead, dozens of small human ships, marked with bright orange training stripes, were dancing around them, executing textbook flanking maneuvers and predictive targeting runs. "Commander!" Xerath's voice crackled from the flagship. "The humans, they're broadcasting on educational frequencies. They're grading our evasive patterns. A human instructor just gave our lead destroyer a C- for predictable shielding. This is an insult! Kael'rath roared, lunging toward Vera. He stopped dead when Gideon, the frail librarian, placed a single hand on the warlord's obsidian-plated chest. The human didn't push. He simply stood there, an immovable object. The groan from the station's depths intensified, a low-frequency vibration that made Kael'rath's secondary heart skip a beat. "Warlord," Vera said calmly, finally looking him in the eyes. "We prefer to think of this as a learning opportunity. If we sent our varsity team, this conversation would have ended 11 minutes ago with your fleet becoming a series of expanding debris clouds." She tapped a button on her tablet, and a holographic bill materialized in the air. "The heirloom clock. 40 million credits. Unauthorized breach of a grade 12 containment site. 2 billion credits. Emotional distress for Mr. Vance. 500 million. We also have a surcharge for interrupting a stage 2 archivist." "Containment site?" Kael'rath hissed, his eyes darting to the floor plates. "You said this was a library." "It is," Gideon whispered, leaning in close enough for Kael'rath to smell the coffee on his breath. "But on Earth, we don't just store books. We store the things that inspired the horror stories, the things we couldn't kill, so we made them the station's foundation." Vera adjusted her glasses. "Kael'rath, you have exactly 60 seconds to sign the reparations agreement and withdraw your forces. If you don't, I have to file a notice of persistent annoyance with the Terran Defense Fleet." "And what happens then?" Kael'rath demanded, his hand hovering over his glowing blade. Gideon smiled, that unsettling human smile that showed too many teeth. "Then we move to Stage 3, Warlord. And Stage 3 is when we stop sending the students and start letting the teachers off their leashes." As the 60-second timer began to count down on the atrium's main screen, the shadows beneath the crystal data stacks began to move. They weren't shifting from the light, they were uncurling. Warlord Kael'rath stared at the countdown timer, his breathing heavy and ragged inside his power armor. The hum of the station was no longer a vibration. It was a physical weight, pressing against his primary and secondary hearts. He looked at Vera Thorne, who was calmly adjusting the settings on her data tablet, as if she were in a quiet office on Earth rather than a contested outpost. "You think a bill will stop me?" Kael'rath hissed. "I will order my fleet to fire. Even if your students dance around them, we will glass this station and everything inside it." "You could try," Vera said, her voice devoid of any emotional heat. "But I wouldn't recommend it. You see, Warlord, your fleet didn't just stumble into a training exercise. You stumbled into an audit. While your officers were busy being annoyed by our sophomores, our logistics division was busy recalculating your existence." Kael'rath's tactical officer, Xerath, screamed over the comms again, his voice now a shrill, panicked trill. "Warlord, our reactors, they're cooling. The fuel isotopes, they're decaying at an impossible rate. What did you do?" Kael'rath demanded, stepping toward Vera with his blade igniting. "We didn't do anything to your ships," Vera replied, tapping a final command. "We did something to your supply chain. 6 months ago, a human-owned shell company won the contract to refine the hephaestium fuel for the Ksar'tal Hegemony. We ensured that every drop of fuel in your fleet was laced with a dormant, non-toxic catalyst. It's perfectly safe until it receives a specific encrypted signal." The Warlord froze. The realization hit him like a kinetic strike. The humans hadn't fought a war. They had conducted a business transaction. They had made his resistance not just difficult, but mathematically impossible. "War is just mathematics, Kael'rath," Gideon added, leaning against a data stack. "Variables and probabilities. You were so focused on our lack of warships that you forgot we control the refineries that keep your warships moving. You're not a conqueror right now. You're an unpaid debt." "This is extortion!" Kael'rath roared, his obsidian armor clacking as he trembled with fury. "No," Vera corrected. "This is a demonstration of what happens when you mistake our preference for peace as an inability to wage war. We don't need to fire a single shot to end your empire. We just have to stop the math from working in your favor." Vera's tablet chirped. "The 60 seconds are up, Warlord. You haven't signed the agreement. That means I have to upgrade your file. This is no longer a civil matter. It's now a security emergency." Kael'rath's pride, forged in 100 planetary conquests, finally shattered. He didn't sign the document. Instead, he lashed out, his massive armored hand swinging in a blind rage. He didn't hit Vera. He struck the ancient wooden chair Gideon had been sitting in, splintering the hand-carved oak into 1,000 pieces. Silence fell over the atrium. Even the gargantuan breathing of the station seemed to stop. Gideon Vales looked down at the remains of his chair, the last piece of furniture from his home on Earth. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He simply took off his spectacles and began cleaning them with a small white cloth. "Gideon," Vera asked, her professional mask slipping for the first time, replaced by genuine concern. Gideon put his glasses back on. His eyes, once soft and piteous, were now as cold and sharp as compressed neutronium. "Vera," Gideon said quietly, "you can stop the audit." "It's irrelevant now." He turned to Kael'rath, and the Warlord felt an ancient, predatory instinct scream at him to run, to jump void and pray for a quick death. "Warlord," Gideon said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Now I'm actually getting annoyed." The floor of the station didn't just groan this time. It split. The atrium of Outpost 99 didn't just rattle. It began to undergo a creative disassembly in reverse. Warlord Kael'rath watched in paralyzed horror as the physical walls, the rows of books and humming crystal stacks, receded into the floor, replaced by a material that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to perceive. The temperature in the room plummeted, not from a loss of life support, but from the presence of something that seemed to absorb the very concept of heat. Gideon Vales stood in the center of the shifting geometry, his faded blue sweater now clashing violently with the iridescent, shimmering sheen that was emerging from the depths of the station. The energy signature spiked so high that Kael'rath's wrist display simply gave up, flickering before labeling the readings as or non-existent in the known physical lexicon. "Warlord," Vera Thorne said, her voice remaining steady as she stepped back into the safety of her shuttle's airlock. "You should have signed the bill. You see, Outpost 99 isn't just a library, it's a focal point. A gravitational anchor for a piece of Earth that we couldn't leave behind when we went to the stars." A massive eye, the size of a Ksar'tal dropship, opened beneath the transparent floor plating. It didn't look like a biological organ. It looked like a localized breakdown in fundamental physical laws. It was an entity that existed partially outside normal space-time. A nightmare that humanity had convinced to sleep for millennia. "You said humans were the apex predators," Kael'rath stammered, his mandibles frozen in a rictus of terror as he looked into an eye that burned with fusion reactions. "We are," Gideon replied, his voice echoing with a resonance that suggested it was no longer being generated by simple human lungs. "But we didn't get to the top of the food chain by being the strongest. We got there because we were the only ones crazy enough to make a bargain with the things that were the strongest." Beyond the station, the 3,000 ships of the Ksar'tal fleet were witnessing the main event. The needle-like station was unfurling like a flower of metal and bone. Wings the size of battlecruisers, composed of quantum probability and dark energy, stretched out into the void. The creature didn't need engines. It banked with a fluid grace that made reality itself recoil, its scales reflecting light in ways that were biologically and physically impossible. One of Kael'rath's destroyers, the Shield of Ksar, attempted a desperate, panicked retreat. It didn't even make it to a jump point. A single tentacle of dark energy, emerging from the station's new form, brushed the ship's hull. The Shield of Ksar didn't explode. Its atoms simply forgot how to bond. It became less real with each passing second, until it was nothing more than a memory of a ship, vaporized and converted to constituent atoms scattered across space. "This is Stage 4. Vera's voice came over the comms, professional and chilling. "The stage where we stop being diplomats and let our planet speak for itself. You've woken up a void dragon, Kael'rath, and it has been hungry for millennia." Kael'rath fell to his knees as the atrium ceiling vanished, exposing him to the cold blackness of space. He should have died instantly from the pressure, but he didn't. The entity held the atmosphere in place through sheer, unreasonable will. Gideon looked down at the Warlord, his human face a mask of cold certainty. "I really like that chair, Kael'rath. It's a shame you didn't choose the math." The void of space was no longer empty. It was crowded by the impossible. Warlord Kael'rath watched through the transparent floor of the unfurling station as his fleet, 3,000 of the hegemony's finest warships, was reduced to a collection of panicked, flickering lights. The human sophomores had retreated, their orange-striped training vessels darting away like birds sensing a coming hurricane. They had finished their lesson. Now the professional cleanup crew was arriving. A second rupture occurred in the fabric of space, just kilometers from the extinction's edge. This wasn't a void dragon. It was something humanoid, yet vast beyond reason. The entity was nearly 300 meters tall, constructed from a living metal that pulsed with a rhythmic, bioluminescent heartbeat. Its eyes were twin fusion reactors that burned with a cold, blue fire. "That is a Titan." Vera Thorne's voice crackled over the open channel, devoid of pity. "We kept them locked in Earth's deep continental fault zones for 10,000 years because we were afraid of what they represented. The proof that our ancestors made bargains with the things that shouldn't exist just to survive a planet that wanted us dead." The Titan didn't use weapons. It simply reached out with a massive hand and closed its fingers around a Ksar'tal heavy cruiser. The most advanced alloy in the Hegemony's arsenal crumpled like parchment. There was no explosion, only the haunting sound of metal screaming, as the Titan converted the ship into a dense, silent ball of scrap. On the bridge of the flagship, Ksar'tal was watching his tactical screens turn into a graveyard. Sector 7. 6 destroyers converted to cosmic dust by the Void Dragon's breath. Sector 4. An entire carrier group, unmade as the atoms of their hulls, simply forgot how to bond. Flagship status: all weapon locks lost. Shields at 0%. Engines cold. Warlord. Ksar'tal's voice was a ragged sob. "They aren't even targeting our military installations anymore. The entities, they're just watching us. They're waiting for something." "They're waiting for me to finish my coffee," Gideon Vales said, his voice now carrying a strange, multi-tonal resonance that echoed through the Ksar'tal comms. Gideon stood at the edge of the station, looking out at the carnage. Around him, smaller creatures began to phase through the shimmering floor. Things with too many limbs and not enough faces, skittering through the air as if gravity were a mere suggestion. "You see, Kael'rath," Gideon continued, "humanity didn't join the Galactic Council to find friends. We joined to find a reason not to do this. We wanted to believe that the universe was better than the hell we crawled out of. We wanted to believe in your rules, your treaties, and your polite trade agreements." He looked at the Warlord, his expression one of ultimate disappointment. "But you proved us wrong. You showed us that the monsters of the galaxy just wear masks and speak of acceptable casualties. So we've decided to stop wearing our masks too." Vera's shuttle began to pull away, its engines glowing with a calm, white light. "Warlord, you have 10 minutes before the Void Dragon decides that your flagship looks like an interesting snack. I suggest you find a way to make your unconditional surrender very, very audible." Kael'rath looked up at the Titan, which was now leaning in, its fusion eyes focused entirely on the extinction's edge. The entity opened its mouth, and the vacuum of space began to glow with the heat of 1,000 suns. "Wait!" Kael'rath shrieked, his pride completely extinguished. "We surrender. Unconditional. Just keep the things away from us." Gideon took a final sip of his coffee and looked at the clock shards on the floor. "The surrender is noted, Warlord. But keeping them away is going to cost you a lot more than a new chair." Suddenly, a new signal flared on the sensors. A TDC battlecruiser, the Resolve, dropping into the sector. It wasn't here to fight the monsters. It was here to put the leashes back on. The TDC battlecruiser Resolve didn't look like a warship of a species that commanded gods. It was a blocky, utilitarian slab of matte gray composite, scarred by micrometeorites and stained by the exhaust of 1,000 systems. It looked like a tool, worn, reliable, and utterly indifferent to the cosmic horror unfolding around it. As it docked with the remains of Outpost 99, the airlock didn't cycle with a hiss of steam, but with the heavy, rhythmic thud of industrial magnets. A team of 4 humans stepped onto the shifting, bioluminescent floor. They weren't wearing the sharp suits of accountants or the sweaters of librarians. They wore bulky, lead-lined hazard suits marked with a symbol Kael'rath had never seen. A stylized chain wrapped around a star. "Status, Gideon?" the lead officer asked, his voice muffled by a heavy-duty respirator. He didn't look at the 300-meter Titan. He didn't look at the Void Dragon currently coiled around a Ksar'tal destroyer like a serpent around an egg. He looked at the floor. "Stage 4 is fully manifest, Commander," Gideon Vales replied, his voice still carrying that unsettling, multitonal resonance. "The Warlord decided to test the structural integrity of my family heirlooms. The guards took it personally." The commander sighed, a sound of pure, bureaucratic exhaustion. "Damn it, Gideon. Do you know the paperwork involved in putting a Titan back into a deep fault nap? We're going to be filing reports for the next 3 solar years." Warlord Kael'rath watched, his mandibles hanging slack, as the human commander walked right up to the edge of the station. The Titan, whose eyes were literal fusion reactors, lowered its massive head until it was inches from the human's face. A single breath from the creature could have vaporized the entire docking bay. Instead, the Titan whimpered. It was a sound that shattered Kael'rath's understanding of the universe. A subsonic frequency of pure, distilled submission. The human commander reached out a gloved hand and tapped the Titan's living metal snout. "Back in the box, big guy," the commander muttered. "You've had your fun. Don't make me bring out the neural dampeners. You know how much you hate the static." Slowly, impossibly, the Titan began to dissolve into a fine metallic mist, receding back into the structural lattice of the station. The Void Dragon followed suit, its dark energy wings folding inward until it was nothing more than a series of glowing runes etched into the crystal data stacks. You treat them like beasts of burden," Kael'rath whispered, his voice trembling with a new kind of terror. "Those are the progenitors of the stars. Those are the ends of worlds." "They're neighbors," Vera Thorne said, stepping out from her shuttle, her tablet still glowing with the final calculations of the Ksar'tal's debt. "Unpleasant, violent neighbors that Earth spent 10 million years learning to live with. We didn't conquer them, Kael'rath. We reached an understanding. We provide the anchors to keep them in this reality, and they provide the security when someone is rude enough to wake us up." The human commander turned to Kael'rath. "Warlord, your surrender has been processed by the Terran Central Command. However, there's a slight complication." "A complication?" "At the hope of survival. The Annoyance Protocol doesn't just stop because the monsters go back to sleep," the commander said, looking at Gideon. "Gideon is still stage 2. Concerned. And when an archivist is concerned, we are legally required to perform a civilizational assessment of the aggressor." Gideon stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Kael'rath. "I've been looking through your empire's metadata while we waited, Warlord. Your history of conquest, your acceptable slavery quotas, your habit of glassing worlds that refuse your trade terms, it's all very messy. Very inefficient." "What are you saying?" Kael'rath hissed. "I'm saying that you aren't just paying a bill in credits," Vera added, her smile returning. That toothy, terrifying human smile. "According to the Annoyance Protocol, the hegemony is now classified as a high-risk asset. We aren't going to destroy you, Kael'rath. That would be a waste of resources." Gideon leaned in, his voice a cold promise. "We're going to reorganize you. Starting with your homeworld's coordinates. We've already moved them." Kael'rath's eyes went wide. "Moved them? You can't move a planet." "We didn't move the planet," Gideon clarified. "We moved the entry in the galactic navigation matrix. To the rest of the galaxy, the Ksar'tal Hegemony no longer exists. You are now behind the same quiet veil that Earth used to hide for centuries." The human commander checked his watch. "The transport ships are already arriving at your capital, Warlord. They aren't carrying soldiers. They're carrying teachers, engineers, and 3 million more junior accountants." Kael'rath looked out at the void, seeing the massive human fleet finally dropping out of warp. Not to fight a war, but to begin an occupation so thorough that his culture would be erased in 3 generations. "Wait," Kael'rath stammered. "If you're moving us behind the veil? If we're being reorganized? What happens to me?" Gideon picked up a single, unbroken gear from his crushed clock and held it up to the light. You're going to help me with my chair. And then we're going to talk about the true reason Earth stays so quiet." The station groaned one last time, but it wasn't a sound of a monster waking up. It was the sound of a heavy metal door locking from the outside. 3 days after the Annoyance began, the sector of space once known as the Ksar'tal Hegemony went dark. It wasn't a violent darkness, it was a bureaucratic one. To any ship entering the sector, their navigation computers simply reported empty space. The jump gates redirected travelers to neighboring systems without explanation. The hegemony had been moved into the back row of the universe. Inside the Veil, Warlord Kael'rath sat on the floor of the reconstructed atrium of Outpost 99. He was no longer wearing his obsidian power armor. He wore a simple gray jumpsuits, the standard attire for civilizational re-education. Vera Thorne stood over him, tapping a final sequence into her tablet. "The audit is complete, Kael'rath. Your Empire's assets have been seized to cover the reparations. Your warships are being dismantled to build schools and hospitals. Your officers are being retrained in ethics and supply chain management. You've erased us," Kael'rath whispered, staring at his trembling hands. "Without firing a single nuclear warhead, you've erased 10,000 years of conquest." "We didn't erase you," Gideon Vales said, walking into the room. He was carrying his grandfather's clock. It was fixed. The gears clicked with a perfect rhythmic precision that filled the silent room. We just gave you a chance to start over. To learn the lesson we learned the hard way back on Earth. That power isn't about how many worlds you can burn. It's about how many worlds you can convince to let you sit in the back row. Kael'rath looked at the clock. Why the back row? Why hide your titans? Why play the accountant and the librarian? Gideon sat down in a new wooden chair, sturdier than the last. Because when you sit in the front row, everyone is watching you. You're the target. You have to be loud, you have to be aggressive, but when you sit in the back row, you can see everything. You see who is plotting, who is failing, and who is about to make a mistake. He leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the cold light of the Oort cloud outside. Humanity spent its youth being the monster in the front row. We almost didn't survive it. Now we prefer to be the ones who hold the leashes. We stay quiet, we stay patient, and we stay helpful. But what if someone finds us? Kael'rath asked, looking toward the shimmering, quiet veil. What if another empire like mine comes along? Vera adjusted her glasses, her professional mask finally settling into a look of genuine peace. Then they'll find a librarian. They'll find an accountant. And if they're very, very lucky, they'll stop before they reach stage 2. The Resolve prepared to depart, leaving the station to its silent vigil. Outpost 99 was once again a needle in the dark, a library at the edge of the world. But now it was also a tombstone for an empire that forgot to listen. Gideon looked at his clock one last time. Time is a human invention, Kael'rath. We use it to measure how long it takes for a predator to realize it's actually the prey. Your time just ran out. As the human ships disappeared into warp, the Ksar'tal sector faded from the consciousness of the galaxy. On Earth, in a deep bunker beneath the mountains, a single light on a console turned from red to green. The Annoyance Protocol was deactivated. The guards went back to sleep, and humanity went back to being the most polite, helpful, and terrifying species in the stars.